have a cellular phone or a pager, something that might disrupt the service, if you wouldn't mind just to take a moment to turn it off and make sure it's on phone. And officiating today's services will be Rabbi Bruce Elder.
If folks want to spread over here and come a little closer, you can do that too, so that we're a little closer here, but still far from each other. Yeah, if you want. So there, you're fine there too, I mean. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam dayan ha'amet. We praise you, Adonai, our God, creator of the universe, judge of truth. Adonai ma adam b'teda ehu b'anosh vat chashvehu. Adam lehevel dama yamav ketzel over. B'boker yatzitz v'chalaf le'erev yamalev v'yavesh teshev anosh adakav v'tomer shuvu v'nei adam. O God, what are we that you take knowledge of us, or that you make account of us? We are like a fleeting breath, our days are as a shadow. In the morning we flourish and grow up, in the evening we are cut down and wither. You turn us to contrition and declare, return to me, oh, that we were wise and would consider our final end. The glory of humanity resides with us, the living in eternal memory. We endure forever in the heritage we leave behind. Esanai el ha'hari me'ayin yavo ezri me'im Adonai oseh shemayim ba'aretz. I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. What is the source of my help? The source of my help is Adonai, creator of heaven and earth. God will not let you falter. Your guardian will not slumber. Surely the guardian of Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. God is your protector, the shelter at your right hand. The sun shall not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. Adonai will protect you from all harm and preserve your soul, guarding your going and your coming, now and forevermore. Death has taken our beloved Nate. Our friends grieve in their darkened world. In their silence there is lamentation, in their tears there is loneliness. Lost in their sorrow, may they find the presence of loving friends. Hear them, O God, be with them. For Nate's love that united in life and which death cannot sever. For his companionship that was shared along life's path and which continues through the tenderness of memory. For the gifts of his heart and mind that brought joy and happiness and are now but precious remembrances. For all these and more, we give our thanks to God. The words of the 23rd Psalm. Adonai roi lo eksar bino deshe yar bitzeni al me menuchot shenachaleni. Nafshi yeshovev yancheni v'maglei tzedek lema'an shemo. Gam ki elech begeit salamavet lo irara ki ata imadi. Shiftecha mishantecha hema yanachamuni. Ta'aroch lefanai shochan neged sororai dishanta v'shemen roshi kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yamei chayai. V'shavti b'veit Adonai la'orech yamim. As its words are familiar to us, if you care to join along, also in your little booklet. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. For everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to grieve, and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to discard. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. In 1972, Nate brought an Egyptian man into his accounting firm at a time when tensions between Jews, a large portion of Nate's clients, and Arabs were high. For Nate, he was the right person to hire regardless of his ethnicity. The following year, the Yom Kippur War broke out. Jews refused to eat at Pita Inn in Skokie as an act of solidarity with Israel. Nate thought that was absurd. They are American like us, he would say. They are not my enemy or the enemy. A firm supporter of Israel during the war and beyond, Nate nonetheless made a point of taking his family and eating there, as uncomfortable as it might have been for them, and it wasn't for Nate. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Nate was an iconoclast that way. He had strong opinions on certain topics and acted on those opinions. To know Nate was to know what he cared about and how much he cared about it. His interests were diverse, if not eclectic. They could even be considered random to some. But the passion he brought to his ideals and ideals was as constant as it was heartfelt. Take the Civil War, for example. Nate was passionate about it. He knew everything about it. He studied it, discussed it, orated on it, and thought about it constantly. He participated in a Civil War roundtable for much of his adult life. He was a great admirer of Lincoln, Grant, and Stonewall Jackson. Nate took the family on a month-long road trip to all the famous war sites of the southern states, cruising their back roads in his lime green Lincoln Continental for the nooks and crannies of memory that brought the war to life for his sons and for him. Lucy, I love this. It wasn't until you were in the second grade that you realized upon learning about the Civil War in school that your grandfather wasn't actually alive during it, but just knew so much about it and loved to tell you all about it. And one of the greatest compliments he ever offered you was to tell you that the Gettysburg Address was second only to your high school graduation speech. Or take Christopher Columbus. Nate loved to talk about Christopher Columbus, buying into the theory that the discoverer was Jewish and not understanding how everyone did not know or believe it. Nate studied about Columbus, talked about Columbus, went to Spain to do research on Columbus, cut newspaper clippings out about Columbus, and weave Columbus into any conversation he could. Just this past Columbus Day, Nate overwhelmed an unsuspecting hospice nurse with all his thoughts on the explorer. She, like the rest of us, simply needed to know all about him. He was like that about politics too. Nate studied politics and knew politics and acted on his convictions loudly and forcefully. He framed Truman's quote about Nixon, "Richard Nixon is a no-good lying bastard," and hung it on the wall of his home. He made it into buttons and had Mike try to sell them at his elementary school. Mike gave them to his friends instead. John, you knew all about impeachment by the second grade. Nate made sure of that. And Nate wrote a song for the 1980 presidential election called None of the Above that got played on local radio stations. He felt that an active no vote should be an option and was as strong a vote as any. Lincolnwood's Henry Pressel was, according to record books, the longest serving mayor in the world, having first been elected in 1931. By 1972, Nate felt that it was time for Pressel to go, so he threw his full support behind Jo Zuckerman, the woman running against him, and who ultimately lost in her bid to unseat him. He campaigned hard for her, putting a huge Zuckerman for mayor sign on the roof of that lime green Continental of his, and driving it unabashedly through town, a sign that he flipped over after the election and wrote in big block letters, "Respect and discipline," and a not-so-subtle message to John. Do you notice a pattern? Nate found an idea that intrigued or excited him, and before you knew it, he was completely immersed and engulfed by it, almost obsessively so. And before long, he was anxious to share his particular take on it, not only with those he loved and knew, but with the entire world, with anyone who would listen, and sometimes even those who would not. Nate was like that for at least his post-adolescent years and thereafter. He was always in his head thinking about stuff and sharing his thoughts about what he was thinking. Every day he took his large scissors to the Daily News or the Sun-Times, finding articles of interest, cutting them out, commenting on them, copying them, and sending them to whomever he wanted to think about the particular topic. The margins of his books were filled with his thoughts and comments. Nate knew he was right about the topics he embraced and felt that responsibility to share his takes on them with all of us. If you got him started, he wouldn't stop. If a matter being discussed was not important to him, though, he didn't care much about it beyond a cursory way, if at all. There was plenty more about which he cared. Nate was well-read and well-cultured. Marie and he traveled extensively. His trip to Spain introduced him to the Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, sending him on one of his knowledge journeys and padding his already strong sense of Jewish self. He knew classical music inside out, opera too. He wrote poetry, including one called The Truth, an ode to, you guessed it, Christopher Columbus. Nate appreciated musical theater and had an extensive music collection. Marie and he attended plays and operas and the symphony. And Nate was a movie buff, a fanatic even, who didn't just watch a movie, not Nate. He analyzed any movie that caught his eye, watching it over and over and over again until he knew it well enough to understand it. Citizen Kane, 3 Days of the Condor, Chariots of Fire. John and Mike saw Nate's favorites so many times in a row and thereafter that they couldn't help but memorize large passages of them. Nate was analytical and practical. He knew how to harness his intellect, discipline, and ambition to succeed. A professor at DePaul told him that accounting was a good way to make a living, so he became an accountant. For Nate, accounting was truth. He had a love for the higher art of it, the brainy meta aspects of it. He studied it deeply, as you would expect of him, and he was good with numbers. Nate's clients trusted him for his integrity and his thoroughness. And in moments of levity or cynicism, he would say what he told Asher, and I quote, "Accounting is the process of checking over a group of figures that 3 or 4 people checked before you and 3 or 4 people will check after you." Nate took the right steps throughout his life to be successful and stable. He might have been eccentric, but he had a good head on his shoulders in so many ways. It could have turned out differently. Nate's childhood was traumatic, to say the least. His mother died when he was 4 or 5. His father, Sam, suffering from polio, could not raise him. Nate spent time living in complete destitution. He jumped around in foster homes for a time, always keeping in touch with his father. At the age of 6 or so, after a particularly difficult stay with the foster family, in which an older boy bullied him and he defended himself, Nate was lucky enough to land in the home of Herman and Bess Kustin. Kustins did not have children of their own, and Nate became like a son to them. They were stable, reliable, and loving. They took in other children as well, primarily the sons and daughters of family members who could not raise them. Nate found safety and security with the Kustins. He found comfort. He found a family. He found home. You could say that they saved Nate's life. Harvey Kustin was one of the children who stayed with Harvey and Bess. With Herman and Bess. He came when he was around 3 years old or so. Nate was 7 or 8 at the time and immediately took Harvey under his wing, caring for him, protecting him, taking him around, being there for him. To Harvey, Nate was larger than life. And that says so much about Nate. Despite his trauma, he was able to care. Despite his trauma, he was able to grow when nurtured. Despite his trauma, Nate made it with good values, great smarts, and important survival skills. He came out of it with an adventurous side as well. That is one of the things that attracted Marie to him when Harvey introduced them, and it never faded over their 50-plus loving, caring years together. Nate loved the off-the-beaten path. Let me restate that. To love it implies that he sought it out. Nate was the off-the-beaten path. It was the space he naturally occupied. It was not, for example, that he took his kids for Mexican food in authentic Mexican neighborhoods, places that most Jews growing up in Lincolnwood would never consider entering. It was not that he did that because he wanted them to have authentic experiences. Nate took them there because that's where you went to get authentic Mexican food. It might have been an adventure for Mike and John. It was what you did if you were Nate. What was quirky to others was natural to him. You said it, John, your father was of a different mold. Nate wanted his children to be self-sufficient. He wanted them to know they could endure. He wanted them to make sure they got and kept their lives together, to learn for themselves, and to speak their truth. Mike and John, all of which you both did. But rather than hear that from me, I turned to the two of you instead. Mike, why don't you come up first?
Thank you all for coming out here on this miraculous and sad day. And thanks to the people that are streaming and will listen to the service. Sometime after my 16th birthday, my dad approached me and asked what I planned to do for the summer. I haven't given it any thought for sure. Up until that point, my summers were spent at camp, or most recently, hanging with friends, and I figured this summer would be the same. My dad had a different agenda, and I sensed as much with him bringing up the topic. I can't recall the exact words, but the gist of what he said was, "I think it's time for you to get a job." It was a well-known story to me and John that my dad worked at Goldblatt's from the age of 14 and became ultimately a butcher before high school or during high school. He was proud of getting this job, and I believe, the 2 years, I was 2 years overdue for filing in his footsteps. Sensing my dad's seriousness and his request to get the job, I did absolutely nothing. I want to think that my dad had this conversation with me on my 16th birthday, something well within his quirky sense of humor, but it was probably closer to April or May. I know that I hadn't given it one more thought until my dad brought it up the day I finished my sophomore year in high school. With no job lined up, my dad informed me that he took the liberty of getting me one, working it with one of his clients at a company called SM&R, a retail wholesaler. What would I be doing, I asked. Whatever they ask you to do, I'm pretty sure his reply was. He said I would be making minimum wage, which was then $3 an hour. I spent the summer in a very hot warehouse, packing boxes, loading and unloading trucks, and then when there was nothing else to do, moving cash registers to different areas of the sweltering warehouse. Oh, and I forgot, my favorite part was picking up garbage in the air-conditioned front part of the office. When I finished working there at the end of the summer, I spent some of what I made on a stereo so that I could play in my bullshit music that my dad used to like to make fun of. The irony of me having extra cash that allowed me to buy a stereo to play this loud bullshit music was not lost on me. The next year, around early spring, my dad asked me if I was going back to SM&R, the place I worked the previous year. I'm sure I hadn't given it thought since my last day there, but I recall very vividly that I wanted something else, and that if that was going to happen, I was going to need to take some action. I called up a distant relative that was an electrical engineer, actually the only adult I knew that wasn't an accountant, lawyer, or businessman. I recall being nervous and hesitant, but I got a lucky break, and arrangements were made for me to work at this engineering firm. Uh-oh. I was so excited not to work in the warehouse that I didn't even ask what I was going to make. On my first day, I was shown my own workbench with all sorts of electronic testing equipment. Of all things, an air-conditioned building. Shortly after I got there on that day, someone from H&R came down and we completed a bunch of paperwork. It was then that I found out I was going to be making 3 times my previous summer's wages. You can imagine how inflated my 17-year-old ego was. That night at dinner, I was excited to tell my dad. Excited to explain to him that my job was better than SM&R, the job that he got me on all fronts. I wasn't in a 110-degree warehouse. It was air-conditioned. I was making 3 times as much, and most importantly, I was doing something I liked. I'll admit I was coming from a place of gloating, of letting him know that I did this by myself. I can't remember his reaction. I can't remember what he said. I'm sure I was too self-absorbed in my own hubris. At some point several years later, after recounting this story, it finally dawned on me that while I was responsible for taking the action to get the second job, that would never have happened without his requiring me to take the first one. Dad was sometimes subtle that way, letting me soak up an experience without saying much. Other times he said all too much. In the last few days, these stories have taken center stage as John and I have been talking about them on bike rides or reflecting on them with our families. Somehow, in the last 10 years, the tables have turned, and the 2 people that cared for me and John required the focus and attention of our care. As so many of us know, dealing with aging parents, the time we spend with them often comes down to doctor appointments, logistics, health decisions, and longer-term care choices. In doing all these things, I didn't really have much time or energy to reflect on the role my dad played in the person I am. Dad, you are at rest. And in that rest, I have started to realize that somehow you took your unique, sometimes painful life experiences and managed to provide me and John with a colorful one. The kind of upbringing that I suspect I will continue to reflect on in the coming days, months, and years. And for that, I am forever ever grateful. I love you, Dad.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of our family, I want to thank those of you who are here in person and all of you who are able to join us virtually today. I also want to thank everyone who has reached out to us to send condolences these last few days. It's really been so supportive to all of us during this difficult time. Many of you have shared sweet and funny stories and impressions about Dad, which I have loved to hear. Some of them I've never heard before. I hope to hear more of these in the coming days and weeks. The fact is, from an early age, I got used to hearing from people that my dad made a strong impression on them. He held unique beliefs and contrarian opinions, which he was generous in sharing, oftentimes in very creative ways. He cared deeply about causes and about people close to him. He was intellectually curious, forever a student of history, and committed to uncovering what he believed was the truth. As his son, I can tell you he made a strong impression on me too. I loved him deeply, and I learned so much from him when he was alive. Of course, I love him still, and I believe I will continue to learn from him in my years ahead. I wanted to share with you some stories about my dad, some things that I believe recall who he was and what he meant to me. Some of these you may have heard little bits of already, so please bear with me. By any measure, my dad's childhood got off to a very rough start. He was born to parents, Grandma Molly and Grandpa Sam, who were relatively old by Depression-era standards when they had him at ages 33 and 39. When he was 4, as we heard, his mother died, and his father's poor health and financial circumstances required that he be placed at that very tender age into a series of foster homes, which for 2 years we have come to learn were not particularly loving or nurturing. Fortunately, age 7, all of that changed when he came to live in the home of Grandma Bess and Grandpa Herman, which was clearly a turning point in his life. They gave him love and direction which he needed, and with which he thrived afterward. It's not something my dad talked about much, but I think he lived his life feeling like he had survived a near disaster during what were probably a very difficult couple of years of his early childhood. I believe this hardship, followed by the salvation from Bess and Herman, shaped who he was. While Grandma Bess passed away when I was just a baby, my dad made sure Mike and I had a very close relationship with both of his fathers, and also with Grandpa Herman's second wife, Grandma Vi, all of whom we love dearly. Another turning point in my dad's life was meeting my mom, to whom he was introduced by his cousin Harvey. My parents had different upbringings and sometimes diverging interests, but they found tremendous common ground with a great circle of friends, whom we referred to as our aunts and uncles, and in creating a loving and nurturing home for my brother and me. As we heard, Dad, along with Mom, planned for our family every year elaborate car vacations for our summer breaks. On none of these was my dad's influence more present than 1976, when we spent an entire month driving to all the major Civil War battlefields: Gettysburg, Manassas, Vicksburg, Fort Sumter, Antietam, and Savannah, to name actually just a few. Thinking about it now, I wonder what they thought of us down south that summer. A bunch of Yankees from Chicago in my dad's light green Lincoln Continental with Land of Lincoln and Village of Lincolnwood plates. Lincoln, incidentally, was one of my dad's favorite historical figures. When I was in second grade, my dad coached my Little League baseball team. He took his responsibilities as coach very seriously. Of course, he taught my teammates and me to keep our eye on the ball when swinging at pitches and to kneel and use two hands when fielding grounders. But he also made sure in 1974 that we 8-year-olds fully understood why it was so important that our president, Nixon, needed to be impeached. That latter lesson likely stuck more than anything to do with baseball. My dad loved movies, which he got from Grandpa Herman, who worked in the film business his whole life. My parents always took us to see great films at the Lincoln Village, Old Orchard, and Skokie theaters. Videotape was a game changer for my dad, and he had an extensive library of recorded favorites. For my dad, as we heard, the only way to watch a truly beloved film was to set aside an entire weekend or so and take it in over and over and over until you pretty much had it memorized. Some that come to mind for me, and as we heard, Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, Chariots of Fire, The Man Who Would Be King, and of course, who could forget 3 Days of the Condor. I could do entire scenes by memory from each of these as a kid. Please ask me at the Shiva and I will do it. Pam, who got to know my dad on his visits to San Diego and our visits to Chicago years ago, reminded me that my dad also loved to watch Jeopardy with my mom, something which I had forgotten. Recalling obscure facts and demonstrating knowledge was right up his alley. They recorded the daily episode on that tank of a VHS recorder, and a favorite activity for them was to watch it together at night after dinner. I loved how they tried to outdo each other to answer the most difficult questions. Dad, I know it's your funeral, but Mom almost always won. My dad firmly believed Christopher Columbus was Jewish, and that he left Spain not to find the New World, but to escape the Spanish Inquisition. In '78, Dad spent an entire month in Spain researching that topic, largely for his own edification, and he talked with us about the things he learned there throughout his life, as he did with everyone he ever came in contact with. My dad watched the news intently, and he read the newspaper twice a day, the Sun-Times and the Daily News. With a pen to write notes in the margins and a scissors to clip out important articles after he'd annotated them, those articles made it into the many letters he sent me over the years. My dad was a fantastic letter writer, a constant stream of which gave me tremendous support throughout my life, especially when I was deployed in the Marines in 1991. I heard from others that my dad was very worried about me then. I guess that's kind of a shock. But his letters didn't show that, and they helped give me strength during a very difficult time. Presidential politics was another great interest of Dad's. For that 1980 election, my dad wrote that song, None of the Above, memorializing how he planned to vote when faced with the choices of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and John Anderson. He actually had 45s pressed of it, and the song was played on the radio and even got picked up by the local news. As a teenager, I remember being so proud of him for doing that. But Jimmy, John, and Ronnie ain't the choice I'm thinking of. I'm gonna put my X right next to none of the above. I can go on and on with these stories, but I'll fast forward just a bit and say about my dad that, oh man, was he proud of his grandchildren, whom he adored. He wasn't always the most demonstrative with his love. That's just not who he was, maybe due to his own early childhood. But I am sure that Izzy, Lucy, Simon, and Asher felt his pride and his love for them. In his later years, it was very difficult for him to travel. But there was no way he was going to miss the bar mitzvahs of his New York grandsons. And he made it out for both, which will always be a cherished memory for all of us. He talked about his grandchildren with anyone who would listen all the time, up until the very end of his life. There's a lot that I'm so grateful for, even at this sad time after my dad's passing. I'm thankful for the many lessons he taught me, both the intended ones and the unintended ones. I'm grateful that several years ago, before my mom passed away, I was able to better understand some of the more difficult issues we had, which allowed me to truly enjoy these last years with him and to speak with him very openly. I'm grateful for the week I spent with him here in September, when we were able to share many memories from throughout his life, and I was able to tell him over and over that I loved him and appreciated all he gave me. That was also a gift that I will cherish for the rest of my life. I'm grateful for the amazing care my dad received when he was not well, especially these last several months. Beyond all that Mike, Audrey, Izzy, and Lucy were able to do for him, we were blessed with some wonderful caregivers who showed real concern and love. Deirdre at Embark, Amanda of Suncrest, Basama at Avantara, and so many others, some of whom I'll never know. And of course, I'm grateful that I made it back to be with him for his last hours on Thursday and to help him leave this world hearing that he was loved and appreciated and listening to a very special song that he had requested. Dad, I love you. I appreciate all you taught me. I can only imagine how the afterlife works, but I like to believe somewhere out there you've just reunited with Mom, your 5 parents, your in-laws, Grandpa Harry and Grandma Leah, Duke and Tiger, and soon enough, you'll be able to corner in intense conversations the likes of Lincoln, Maimonides, and Columbus. Rest in peace, Dad.
Nate, you were an old soul that had to grow up too fast. And look what you did with your life. You found a wonderful spouse and created a beautiful family. You challenged the world not to be different, but to be itself, each and every one of us. You taught us about things we didn't think we cared about, but you made us care about them because they were so important to you. You were a model in so many subtle, beautiful, eccentric ways. God love you. Your mind, your ideas, your values, your journey, they are ours now. Thank you. Zinchrocha levracha, your memory is a blessing. Amen. Turn now to 2 of those grandchildren. Izzy and Lucy are going to lead us in a song from Debbie Friedman, Lech Lecha. Come on over here, guys. מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, עמסי מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, עם קדושים וטהרים כזהר הקיאה מזהירים. את נשמת יקרנו שלח לעולמו, בעל הרחמים, יסירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור ביצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו. ונאמר אמן. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to our beloved Nate who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in your eternal presence and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. Kaddish Yatom, Mourner's Kaddish. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah. V'yalma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. V'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam olomei omaya. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit roman v'yit naseh. V'yit hadar v'yit alev v'yit halal shemei dekudshah barichu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Damiran b'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. We've come to perhaps the most important and difficult part of the funeral. We Jews believe that from the earth we came, into the earth we return, so the greatest mitzvah or commandment we can perform is to help Nate go home. We do so by placing some earth upon the casket. So in a minute, after the casket's lowered, I'm going to ask John and Mike, and then the immediate family, and then anybody else who would like to place some earth upon it. For those of you who would like, Mike brought a shovel that you could use. There's gloves if you'd like to use them as well. For those of you who don't want to use the same shovel, there are little cups here that you can scoop into the pail and use accordingly. Lech ki shalachach Adonai, go your way, for God has called you. Lech v'Adonai yeh imach, go your way and may God be with you. Malach lefanecha tzidkecha, kavod Adonai ya'asfecha. May your righteousness go before you, and the glory of God receive you. Omekomo yavo b'shalom. Nate, may you come to your eternal home in peace.
Did you have a chance to participate? Friends, this concludes the services here at the cemetery. In just a few moments, the cemetery staff will complete the task of putting the vault cover in place and filling the grave. If you wish to stay and witness that, you may do so. If not, you may return to your cars. Thank you.